The restaurant was loud with Christmas Eve cheer, but Ellie Morgan heard none of it. Across the table, her blind date leaned in, his hand sliding over hers. "A woman like you needs a real man to take care of her," he said, smiling like he'd done her a favor. Her phone was already out. The text went to one person. Jack Reynolds read it in his living room, didn't hesitate, and grabbed his coat. He thought he was just being kind. He had no idea she'd been in love with him for years. 3 days before that text message, Jack Reynolds was standing in Ellie Morgan's office with a tablet in one hand and her usual afternoon coffee in the other. He set the cup down on her desk without a word. She glanced up from her laptop, saw the steam rising from the lid, and something in her chest tightened. He always remembered. 2 sugars, no cream, extra hot. 5 years working together, and he still got it right every single time. "Tokyo confirmed for January 9th, Jack said, scrolling through the schedule on his tablet. "They want the full presentation, not the summary. I already booked your flight for the 7th. That gives you a day to adjust before the meeting." Ellie nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It burned her tongue a little, exactly the way she liked it. She watched him over the rim of the cup. He was focused on the screen. His brow furrowed the way it always did when he was working through logistics. He had no idea she was looking at him like this. He never did. "You're a lifesaver," she said quietly. Jack glanced up and smiled, the kind of smile that made the edges of his eyes crinkle. "That's what they pay me for," he said. She wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that what he did went far beyond a job description, that she didn't know how she would function without him. But she didn't say any of that. She just smiled back and pretended her heart wasn't racing. Jack moved toward the window, looking out over the city. The office was on the 42nd floor, and from here you could see all the way to the harbor. The skyline was starting to light up as the afternoon faded into evening. Christmas decorations lined the streets below. Strings of white lights tangled between the buildings like something out of a postcard. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, and Ellie let herself look at him without pretending not to. The way his shoulders curved slightly forward when he was tired, the way his hair was just a little too long in the back because he never had time to get it cut, the way he existed in her life like gravity, invisible and essential. "How's your daughter doing?" Ellie asked, pulling herself back to safer ground. Jack turned, and his whole face changed. It always did when someone mentioned her. "She's good," he said. "Excited about Christmas. She made me promise we'd get a real tree this year. Not one of those fake ones from the store." Ellie smiled. "That sounds like a lot of work." Jack shrugged. "Yeah, but she's worth it." There was something in the way he said it that made Ellie's throat tighten. He was a good father, the kind of father who showed up, who didn't run when things got hard. She thought about his ex-wife sometimes, though Jack rarely talked about her. Ellie only knew the basics. The woman had left 3 years ago, walked out on both of them without much explanation. Jack had been doing it alone ever since, working full-time, raising a kid, managing everything with a kind of quiet competence that most people didn't even notice. But Ellie noticed. She always noticed. "You should take a day off," Ellie said. "Spend some time with her before the holidays get too crazy." Jack shook his head. "I'm fine. Besides, you need me here. The investor meeting is next week and we still haven't finalized the pitch deck." Ellie wanted to argue, but she knew it wouldn't do any good. Jack didn't take days off. He didn't ask for help. He just kept moving forward, the same way he always had. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced down and saw her mother's name on the screen. A familiar weight settled in her stomach. She let it ring. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Not important?" he asked. Ellie forced a smile. "Just my mom. I'll call her back later." She wouldn't, though. She knew what her mother wanted. The same thing she wanted every time she called. A grandchild. A son-in-law. Some proof that Ellie's life wasn't just spreadsheets and board meetings. Jack didn't push. He never did. He just nodded and went back to his tablet, scrolling through the rest of the week's schedule. Ellie watched him for another moment, then turned back to her laptop. The quarterly report stared back at her, rows of numbers that should have meant something but didn't. She couldn't focus, not with him standing there, not with the way her heart kept doing this stupid, painful thing every time he smiled. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. Her mother. "Call me when you have a minute. I have someone I want you to meet." Ellie closed her eyes. Here it came. Another setup. Another well-meaning disaster. Her mother had been doing this for years now, introducing her to the sons of friends, colleagues, acquaintances. Men with good jobs and clean records and zero chemistry. Ellie had gone along with it at first, thinking maybe one of them would surprise her, but none of them ever did. None of them were Jack. She typed back a quick reply. "I'm busy this week. Maybe after the holidays." The response came almost immediately. "I already told him you'd meet him on Christmas Eve, 7 o'clock at Le Bernardin. Don't be late." Ellie stared at the message. Christmas Eve. Of course. Her mother knew she couldn't say no to Christmas Eve. It was the one night of the year when Ellie felt the loneliness more acutely than usual. The one night when being alone felt like failure. Jack was watching her now. "Everything okay?" he asked. Ellie looked up, forcing her expression into something neutral. "Yeah," she said. "Just family stuff." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that told her he didn't quite believe her. He always knew when she was lying. He just never called her on it. "You working late tonight?" Jack asked. Ellie shook her head. "No, I'm going to head out soon. You should too. Go home to your daughter." Jack smiled. "I will. I just want to finish updating the client files first." Ellie knew that meant he'd be here for another 2 hours at least. She wanted to tell him to stop, to go home, to take care of himself the way he took care of everyone else. But she didn't. She never did. That night, Ellie sat alone in her apartment with a glass of wine and her mother's text still glowing on her phone screen. Christmas Eve, Le Bernardin, 7 o'clock. She could already picture it. Some overly confident man in an expensive suit. Small talk about stocks or real estate or whatever it was successful men talked about when they were trying to impress someone. The inevitable moment when he'd lean in and say something condescending, something that made it clear he thought she needed saving. She thought about texting her mother back, making up an excuse, canceling the whole thing. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Her mother would just reschedule, would keep pushing until Ellie gave in. It was easier to just go, to sit through one dinner and let her mother believe she was trying. Ellie looked out the window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Jack was probably reading his daughter a bedtime story, probably smiling that soft, unguarded smile he only had when he talked about her. Ellie wondered what it would be like to be part of that, to be someone Jack came home to be more than just his boss, more than just the person who needed him. She finished the wine and set the glass down on the coffee table. Christmas Eve. She'd go. She'd sit through the dinner. She'd smile and nod and pretend to be interested. And then, when it got unbearable, she'd do what she always did. She'd text Jack, and he'd come. Because that's what he did. He showed up. He always showed up. What Ellie didn't know was that this time would be different. This time, the man sitting across from her would say something that crossed a line. This time, she wouldn't just be uncomfortable, she'd be desperate. And when Jack came to rescue her, something would shift. Something neither of them was ready for. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Ellie stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes trying to decide what to wear to a dinner she didn't want to attend. She finally settled on a black dress, simple and professional, the kind of thing that said she was making an effort without trying too hard. In the mirror, she looked composed, successful, exactly the kind of woman her mother wanted her to be. She felt nothing like that on the inside. Le Bernardin was packed when she arrived. The restaurant glowed with soft light and expensive decorations, white tablecloths and champagne glasses catching the reflections of tiny crystal chandeliers. Ellie gave her name to the hostess and was led to a table near the window. The man was already there. He stood when she approached, extending a hand. His grip was too firm, the kind that was trying to prove something. Ellie, he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. I'm Trevor. Your mother's told me a lot about you. Ellie forced a smile and sat down. Trevor was exactly what she'd expected. Mid-40s, tailored suit. Watch that probably cost more than most people's cars. He looked like someone who'd never been told no in his life. The waiter appeared with menus, but Trevor waved them away. We'll have the chef's tasting menu, he said, not asking, and a bottle of the Chateau Margaux. The waiter nodded and disappeared. Ellie folded her hands in her lap and tried to look interested as Trevor launched into a monologue about his work. Something about real estate development. Something about a deal he'd closed in Dubai. She nodded at the right moments, made the appropriate sounds of acknowledgement, and wondered how long she had to stay before it would be acceptable to leave. Trevor barely looked at her when he talked. His eyes were on his phone, on the room, on everything except the person sitting across from him. So your mother tells me you run a tech company, Trevor said, finally glancing her way. There was something dismissive in his tone, like he was humoring a child who claimed to have built a spaceship out of cardboard. Ellie straightened slightly. I'm the CEO, yes, she said. Trevor smiled. That's impressive. For a woman, I mean. Must be hard balancing that with, everything else. Ellie felt something cold settle in her chest. Everything else? She asked. Trevor leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. Family. Personal life. A woman like you should be thinking about settling down. Having kids, you can't do that forever, can you? Running a company? Ellie stared at him. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into static. She wanted to stand up and walk out, wanted to tell him exactly what she thought of his outdated, patronizing assumptions. But she stayed seated. She'd been raised to be polite, to not make a scene. The waiter brought the first course. Trevor barely glanced at it before cutting into the fish with surgical precision. I mean, don't get me wrong, he continued, still not looking at her. It's great that you're ambitious, but at the end of the day, a woman needs a man who can take care of her. Someone strong, someone who knows how the world works. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. His palm was warm and damp. Someone like me. Ellie pulled her hand back, her heart pounding. Trevor didn't seem to notice. He just kept talking, kept eating, kept existing in his own self-satisfied bubble. She looked down at her phone under the table. Her fingers moved before she could think about it. The text was short. Simple. SOS. Need rescue now. Le Bernardin. She sent it to Jack and then set the phone face down on her lap, waiting. Across town, Jack was sitting on the floor of his living room with his daughter. They'd spent the evening decorating their tree, stringing lights and hanging ornaments, most of them handmade and lopsided. His daughter was asleep now, curled up on the couch with her favorite blanket pulled up to her chin. Jack looked at her for a long moment, smiling at the way her mouth hung slightly open, the way her hair had fallen across her face. He reached for his phone to check the time and saw Ellie's message. He didn't hesitate. He stood, grabbed his coat, and knocked on his neighbor's door. Mrs. Patterson answered, already in her robe. Emergency? She asked, looking at his face. Jack nodded. Work thing. I'll be back in an hour. She waved him off. Take your time. I'll keep an ear out. Jack thanked her and headed for the door, his mind already running through what he'd say when he got to the restaurant. When Jack walked into Le Bernardin 20 minutes later, he was out of breath and his hair was a mess from the wind outside. He scanned the room and found Ellie immediately. She was sitting stiffly at a table near the window, her shoulders tight, her expression frozen. The man across from her was talking, gesturing with his fork, oblivious. Jack crossed the restaurant in long strides, his heart pounding for reasons he didn't fully understand. Ellie, he said, his voice louder than he'd intended. She looked up, and the relief in her eyes was so immediate and so raw that something in Jack's chest twisted. He forced himself to focus. I've been trying to call you. It's Tokyo. They moved the meeting up. They want a conference in 20 minutes. Trevor looked up, annoyed. Who's this? he asked. Jack ignored him. We need to go. Now. Ellie stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. I'm so sorry, she said to Trevor, her voice tight. This is urgent. I have to go. Trevor frowned, setting down his fork. You're leaving? In the middle of dinner? Ellie was already grabbing her coat. It's work. I don't have a choice. Trevor looked at Jack, then back at Ellie, his expression darkening. This is ridiculous, he said. You're really going to let some assistant dictate your evening? Jack felt his jaw tighten, but Ellie was already moving toward the door. He followed her out into the cold night air, the sound of the restaurant fading behind them. They walked half a block in silence before Ellie finally stopped, leaning against the wall of a building. She was shaking. Not from the cold, from something else. Jack watched her, concerned. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Ellie let out a breath that turned to mist in the frigid air. That was the worst one yet, she said. Jack frowned. Worst what? Ellie looked at him, and there was something vulnerable in her expression that he'd never seen before. Blind date. My mother set it up. I should have known better. Jack shoved his hands in his pockets, unsure what to say. What did he do? He asked. Ellie shook her head. It doesn't matter. You came. That's what matters. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jack felt something shift in the air between them, something he didn't have a name for. Thank you, she said softly. Jack shrugged, trying to keep his voice light. That's what they pay me for. Ellie smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. No, she said. It's not. They found a small coffee shop 2 blocks away, one of those places that stayed open late for the after-theater crowd. It was nearly empty, just a couple sitting in the corner and a barista who looked half asleep behind the counter. Jack ordered 2 coffees and carried them to a table by the window. Outside, the city sparkled with Christmas lights. Strings of color tangled between the street lamps and storefronts. It should have felt festive. Instead, it just felt quiet. Ellie wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. I'm sorry I dragged you out here, she said. Jack shook his head. Don't apologize. I'm glad you called. He meant it. He'd been sitting at home feeling restless, like something was missing. Now he was here, and the restlessness had faded. He didn't question why. They talked for over an hour. About Christmas. About work. About the way the city changed this time of year, how it felt both lonelier and more alive at the same time. Ellie told him about her mother, about the constant pressure to settle down, to be something other than what she was. Jack listened, nodding in all the right places, and somewhere in the middle of it all he said something that made her laugh. A real laugh, not the polite one she used in meetings. It was the best sound he'd heard in months. You deserve better than that, Jack said eventually, his voice quiet. Ellie looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. Better than what? She asked. Jack gestured vaguely. Than guys like that. Guys who don't see you. Ellie felt her breath catch. She wanted to tell him that the only person she wanted to see her was sitting right across the table. But she didn't. She just smiled and said, maybe. When Jack finally walked her to her car, it was past midnight. The streets were empty. The restaurants and bars closed for the night. Ellie unlocked the door and then turned back to him. Merry Christmas, Jack, she said. He smiled. Merry Christmas, Ellie. She got in the car and drove away, and Jack stood there on the sidewalk watching her taillights disappear into the distance. He didn't know why he felt like he'd just lost something important. A week later, Ellie's mother set up another date, then another. Each time Ellie went. Each time it ended badly. And each time she texted Jack. He came every time. Sometimes he invented emergencies. Sometimes he just showed up and made an excuse. Once, he accidentally spilled water all over the table, giving Ellie an out. She laughed about it later, but Jack noticed something had changed. She was looking at him differently. Or maybe he was just imagining it. By the third rescue, Jack started to wonder why she kept going on these dates. Why she kept putting herself through this. He asked her one night over coffee, the same little shop they'd ended up at after the first disaster. Ellie stirred her drink, not meeting his eyes. "I guess I'm still looking," she said. Jack frowned. "For what?" Ellie finally looked up. "For someone like you," she said quietly. Jack laughed, thinking she was joking. "Good luck with that," he said. "I'm not exactly a catch." Ellie's smile faded. "You're wrong," she said. Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he changed the subject. But the words stayed with him. They replayed in his head at strange moments. When he was making dinner, when he was reviewing schedules, when he was lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. 2 weeks into January, Ellie's best friend set her up with someone new. His name was David. He was an architect, soft-spoken and thoughtful, the kind of person who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Ellie agreed to meet him at an art gallery opening, something low-pressure and public. She didn't text Jack this time. She told herself she didn't need to, that maybe this one would be different. David was different. He was kind. He didn't interrupt. He didn't talk down to her or make assumptions about what she wanted. They walked through the gallery together, looking at abstract paintings and sculptures made of twisted metal. David talked about design, about the way spaces could change how people felt. Ellie found herself genuinely interested. When he asked if she wanted to get dinner, she said yes. But even as they sat across from each other at a quiet Italian restaurant, even as David smiled and told her about a project he was working on, Ellie couldn't stop thinking about Jack, about the way he always knew what she needed before she said it, about the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, about the way her heart did that stupid, painful thing every time he walked into a room. She went out with David again, then again. By the fourth date, it was clear he wanted something serious. He said as much one night as they stood outside her apartment building. "I really like you, Ellie," he said, his hands in his pockets. "I think this could be something real." Ellie looked at him and felt nothing but guilt. Because he was right. It could be something real, with someone else, just not with her. Jack saw them together one night in late January. He'd been walking home from the office, cutting through the park to avoid the crowds, when he spotted them on a bench near the fountain. David had his arm around Ellie's shoulders. She was laughing at something he'd said. Jack stopped walking. He stood there in the shadows, watching them, and felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. It took him a full minute to recognize what it was. Jealousy. He turned and walked the other way, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. When he got home, his neighbor asked if everything was okay. Jack said he was fine, but he wasn't. He lay awake that night thinking about Ellie with someone else, thinking about the way she'd looked at David, thinking about how stupid he'd been to believe she might feel the same way he did. At work, Jack became distant. He still did his job, still brought Ellie her coffee, still managed her schedule with the same precision he always had. But he didn't linger in her office anymore, didn't ask how she was doing, didn't offer to stay late, Ellie noticed. She wanted to ask what was wrong, but she didn't know how. The space between them grew wider every day. One morning in early February, Jack walked into Ellie's office and set an envelope on her desk. Ellie looked up from her laptop, confused. "What's this?" she asked. Jack didn't sit down. He stood near the door, his expression unreadable. "My resignation," he said. The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. "What?" she said, standing. "Why?" Jack looked at her, and for the first time in 5 years, she couldn't read his face. "I think it's time for me to move on," he said. "You have David now. You're happy, and I need a fresh start." Ellie felt the room tilt. "Jack, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong?" Jack shook his head. "No, you didn't do anything. This is on me." Ellie took a step toward him. "Then why are you leaving?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jack looked down at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear him. "Because I can't keep doing this," he said. I can't keep working for you when you're with someone else. It's killing me, Ellie. The silence that followed was deafening. Ellie stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Jack, she whispered, but he was already turning toward the door. I'll finish out the week, he said. That should give you time to find a replacement. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Ellie stood there alone in her office, the envelope still sitting on her desk. She didn't open it. She just stared at it, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. She'd been so careful, so controlled, and now she was losing the one person who mattered most. The one person she'd never had the courage to fight for. Ellie sat at her desk long after Jack left, the resignation letter still unopened in front of her. The office was quiet. Everyone had gone home for the day. Outside, the sky had turned that particular shade of gray that came just before dark, the city lights beginning to flicker on one by one. She stared at the envelope and felt something inside her crack open. All these years, she'd convinced herself that silence was safety, that if she never said the words out loud, she could keep him close without risking everything. But she'd been wrong. Silence hadn't protected her. It had just guaranteed she'd lose him. She picked up her phone and scrolled to David's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment before she finally pressed it. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. Ellie, hey, I was just thinking about you. Ellie closed her eyes. David, I need to talk to you, she said. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Okay, he said slowly. That doesn't sound good. Ellie stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. I can't do this anymore, she said quietly. I'm sorry. You're a good person. You deserve someone who can give you everything. But that's not me. David didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. Is there someone else? He asked. Ellie felt her throat tighten. Yes, she said. There always has been. David let out a long breath. Does he know? He asked. Ellie shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. No, she said. Not until today. David was quiet again. Then he said, Go tell him. Ellie felt tears sting her eyes. I don't know if it's too late, she whispered. David's voice softened. Then you better find out. She ended the call and stood there in the empty office, her reflection staring back at her from the dark window. She looked like someone who'd been running for a long time and had finally realized she was running in the wrong direction. She picked up her coat, grabbed her bag, and walked out without looking back. Jack's last day came faster than either of them wanted. Ellie had barely seen him all week. He'd been polite, professional, distant. He brought her coffee in the mornings and left it on her desk without a word. He updated her schedule and sent her reminders about meetings, but he didn't come into her office unless she called him. The space between them felt like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. On Friday afternoon, Ellie watched the clock on her wall tick closer to 5. Jack would leave at 5. He'd pack up his things, walk out the door, and she'd never see him again. Not like this. Not in the space where they'd spent 5 years building something she'd been too afraid to name. She couldn't let that happen. Not without trying. At 4:45, she stood and walked to his desk. Jack was already packing, sliding files into a cardboard box with methodical precision. He didn't look up when she approached. Jack, Ellie said quietly. He stopped moving but didn't turn around. I need to talk to you, she continued. In my office. Jack set down the file he was holding and finally looked at her. His expression was guarded, but there was something else there too, something that looked like pain. Ellie, I don't think that's a good idea, he said. Ellie felt her hands start to shake. Please, she said. It was the please that did it. Jack nodded once and followed her back to her office. She closed the door behind them and turned to face him. I need to know the truth, Ellie said, her voice steadier than she felt. You said you can't keep working for me when I'm with someone else. What did you mean by that? Jack looked at her like she'd just asked him to cut his own heart out. Ellie, don't, he said quietly. She took a step closer. "Tell me," she said. Jack ran a hand through his hair, the gesture rough and frustrated. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "That every time I see you with him, it kills me. That I can't sleep because I keep thinking about you with someone else? That I've been in love with you for so long I can't remember what it was like before?" His voice cracked on the last word. "Is that what you want to hear?" The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Ellie stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "That's exactly what I want to hear." Jack looked at her, confused. "Why?" he asked. Ellie felt the tears she'd been holding back finally break free. "Because I broke up with David 2 days ago," she said. "Because my heart was never his. It's always been yours." Jack went completely still. "What?" he said, his voice barely audible. Ellie took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the way his chest was rising and falling too quickly. "I've been in love with you for years, Jack," she said. "Since before the blind dates. Since before any of this. I was just too scared to tell you. Too scared you'd leave. And now you're leaving anyway. And I can't let you go without telling you the truth." Jack stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You love me?" he asked, the words coming out rough and disbelieving. Ellie nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "I love you," she said. "I love the way you remember my coffee order. I love the way you show up every time I need you. I love the way you're a good father and a good man and you don't even realize how incredible you are. I love you. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." Jack crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms. Ellie felt herself collapse against him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she cried into his chest. He held her tight, one hand in her hair, the other wrapped around her waist like he was afraid she might disappear. "I thought I wasn't good enough for you," he said against her hair. "I thought you could never want someone like me." Ellie pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands coming up to frame his face. "You're everything I want," she said. "You're everything I've ever wanted." Jack looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, like he was still afraid this wasn't real. But then Ellie kissed him back, and something broke open between them. All the years of wanting and waiting and pretending poured into that kiss, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. "So," Jack said, his forehead resting against hers, "does this mean I'm still fired?" Ellie laughed through her tears. "You can't be my assistant anymore," she said. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Ellie smiled. "Because you're going to be too busy being the man I love," she said. Jack grinned, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him in weeks. "I think I can manage that," he said. 1 year later, Ellie and Jack sat at the same table in Le Bernardin where everything had started. This time, there was no blind date, no desperation, no rescue, just the 2 of them, sitting across from each other with wine glasses raised and smiles that didn't need to be forced. The restaurant was just as crowded as it had been that Christmas Eve, but Ellie barely noticed. All she saw was Jack. "I still can't believe we're here," Jack said, looking around. "This place has some bad memories for you." Ellie shook her head. "Not anymore," she said. "This is where you saved me." Jack reached across the table and took her hand. "I think we saved each other," he said. Ellie smiled and threaded her fingers through his. "Yeah," she said. "I think we did." Jack had left the company 6 months ago and started his own consulting firm. Ellie had been his first client, and now she was his business partner. They worked together in a different way now, building something new from the ground up. It was messy and complicated, and sometimes they argued about strategy or budgets or whether to take on a new project. But it was theirs, and at the end of the day, they went home together. Jack pulled something from his pocket and set it on the table between them. It was a small velvet box. Ellie's breath caught. "Jack," she said. He opened the box to reveal a simple ring, a single diamond set in platinum. "I know this is probably not the most romantic place to do this," he said. "But it feels right. This is where everything started, where I realized I couldn't live without you." Ellie looked at him, her eyes already filling with tears. Jack stood and moved to her side of the table, kneeling down beside her chair. The restaurant went quiet around them, other diners turning to watch. "Ellie Morgan," Jack said, his voice steady and sure. "Will you marry me?" Ellie didn't even let him finish. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course, yes." Jack slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and the restaurant erupted in applause. They pulled apart, both of them smiling so wide it hurt. "I love you," Ellie said. Jack kissed her again. "I love you too," he said. "Always have, always will." They left the restaurant hand in hand, walking out into the cold December night. Snow was falling now, soft and steady, covering the city in white. Ellie looked up at Jack, at the way the streetlights caught in his eyes, at the way he was looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. For so long, she'd thought she needed someone to save her, but the truth was simpler than that. She didn't need saving. She just needed someone to see her, to know her, to love her exactly as she was. And Jack had been doing that all along. She'd just been too afraid to notice. They walked through the snow together, toward whatever came next, knowing that this time they weren't running. They were finally home.